Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, here today to do part 2 of my bookshelf tour. The last time I did all of the books on this bookshelf. Today I'm hoping to get to all of the books on this one. We will see how that goes. The way I have decided to structure this is that I'm just going to go shelf by shelf and take the books off, show them to you, maybe have a little blurb about them, tell you whether or not I've read them, and then put them back, move on to the next shelf, and go from there and see how much of it I can fit in for today. So we're going to be picking up with this shelf. You can see this one is a little bit empty. That's because when I removed the J.K. Rowling books from my bookshelf, I also removed Ian Fleming's James Bond books from my shelf. I had been holding on to them for a long time. I think I read them about 3 years ago, and I did not really like them. I thought they were really problematic, but I kept them on my shelf as like a mark of something that I had done and accomplished, but it just didn't seem to make sense to hold on to them. So they're sitting in the closet thinking about what they have done with the J.K. Rowling books. I haven't decided what to do with either one of them because part of me feels loath to put them back out into the world, but it also feels weird to remove them from the shelf just to put them in the closet. I don't know, I haven't decided yet. So let's get into this. I'm going to grab some books, put them down on a chair. Guinness is also on the floor right here, so we're going to try not to drop anything on him or step on him and see how this goes. Okay, we're ready to go, and we start with Bernardine Evaristo. The first book is Mr. Loverman. This is something I bought after Girl, Woman, Other was put on my radar last year, and it just sounded like something that was really interesting, something I wanted to read. I've been intrigued by her backlist ever since I first discovered Girl, Woman, Other, so I ordered this. I've not gotten around to reading it. And then there's Girl, Woman, Other, which I did finish just recently, and we'll be talking about a lot more very soon. Then there is Ask the Dust by John Fante. I have actually owned a copy of this for almost 20 years and have not gotten around to reading it. When I was working at Borders for the first time, someone recommended it to me, said it was his favorite book of all time, and I'm always curious by the books that people describe as their favorite book of all time, so I purchased a copy and just never got around to reading it. So maybe someday. Then Late in August by William Faulkner. I actually read this last year. This was a buddy read with Doris from Aldi Books, and I had never read William Faulkner before except for a single short story back when I was in high school. And I read this and I enjoyed it. I'd be interested in reading more books by him. Then there is Willa and Hesper by Amy Feldman. This was a book I saw on a channel here on BookTube. I want to say it was Mercy's Bookish Musings. It sounded interesting to me, and I ordered it and have not gotten around to reading it yet. So maybe someday. Then we have 1000 White Women by Jim Fergus. I've heard mixed things about this, but would like to get around to reading it someday. I have not yet. And Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. This is the first book in the Neapolitan saga, I believe it's called. Yes, book 1 of the Neapolitan novels. I have actually read this one. I have not read any of the others in the series, and I was very surprised that I loved it as much as I did. I don't know why I was surprised. I heard great things about it, so it probably shouldn't have been the surprise that it was. And I am looking forward to getting to the other 2 books in the series. However, the only one I own is My Brilliant Friend. Then we have 2 celebrity memoirs. The first is Bossy Pants by Tina Fey. I have a signed copy of this because I went and saw her do an author reading the very first day that the book was released, and I have always been a huge Tina Fey fan, so I enjoyed this book. And then In Pieces by Sally Field. I traditionally don't like celebrity memoirs, but I am a big fan of this one. It is very introspective. She's very much searching her life and why things were the way they were and why she had behaved the way she did at certain points to understand who she is today. And I just thought it was really fascinating. Then we have Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding. I purchased this around the time that the movie adaptation came out, which is why I have the movie adaptation of it. I was a big fan of it because I had just read Pride and Prejudice when the movie came out, and I read this, and because this is basically a modern Pride and Prejudice, I enjoyed it, and I had liked the movie at the time. I've now, given the space of about 20 years, part of me feels like I should reread it and see where I would stand on it now, but at the time I really liked it. Then there's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a book that I know a lot of people don't like. However, I am a fan. I really like this book. I think it's great. I am someone who will stand up for The Great Gatsby. I think it's a great book. Then we have Fried Green Tomatoes, The Whistle Stop Cafe. God, I love this book. I have loved Fanny Flagg for a very long time, but I didn't realize she was an author. I only knew her as someone who was on The Match Game, and I used to watch reruns of The Match Game when I was a kid. And when I found out that she wrote Fried Green Tomatoes, because I had seen the movie when it came out, I had always wanted to get around to reading one of the books, and I finally did, and I just loved it. And I've never read any of her other books, so maybe at some point I should probably get around to that. Now we have Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Have not read this. The only book of Gillian Flynn's that I have read is Gone Girl, which I read as an ebook. So I do own a copy, but as an ebook, back when I used to actually read ebooks. Remember that? Then we have Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. I read this when it first came out because I was still working at Borders, and it got a rave review in the New York Times Book Review. It made me very curious. I picked it up, and I remember loving it at the time. I feel like subsequent attempts to read things by Jonathan Safran Foer have been like saturated in kind of deliberate eccentricness and quirkiness, and part of me wonders if I would like this as much if I read it again now. But who knows. Then there's Lucy Foley's The Guest List, which I read back in May, and thought it was kind of fun. Not perfect, but a fun mystery, and I've had a really hard time finding good mysteries lately, so that was a pleasant surprise. Then we have The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. I have never gotten around to reading this, and a lot of that has to do with the size, and part of me thinks it was a foolish endeavor to make sure I had the mass market paperback, because, whoo boy, this is a long book. It is almost 1,000 pages. And the print is very tiny. I don't know if you can see, but someday. I've heard really great things about it, but because of the size, I've always been kind of put off about it. Then there's Full Circle by Michael Thomas Ford. I really enjoyed this book. And one of the things I really like about it is that the protagonist is a gay man who was born in 1950. My father is a gay man who was born in 1950. And it's about his life through up to the present. And I just thought it was fascinating. I think it's kind of a lesser known book. I've read a couple of Michael Thomas Ford's other books. All of those were on ebook as well. Again, remember when I used to read ebooks? Lols for life. And they weren't as good. So, but this one I did really enjoy. And then there is Happiness by Aminata Forna, which I just talked about in my book I'll revisit, and how I have not gotten around to reading it. I hear wildly different things from people. Some people love it, some people hate it, and I don't think I've heard any in between, so that's kind of interesting. Now let's talk about which of these books on this first shelf are going to be TBR items. If you recall, the way I handle my TBR is if I'm interested in reading a book, I just kind of pull it out a little bit more than the other ones, and that way my books are always where they're supposed to be, but I have an easy, quick reference of which ones I want to prioritize if I'm looking for something to read. So immediately I'm going to say Mr. Loverman is going to be pulled out, and actually the other ones on here I've pretty much read. So that's it. The only TBR book on this first shelf will be Mr. Loverman. This is exciting because now in shelf 2 we get to my favorite author, E.M. Forster, and we start with Howard's End, which is one of my 2 favorite books of his. Objectively speaking, Howard's End probably is his best book. Something I read and really, really love, and it's one of those modern library editions that I used to be obsessed with. Then we have The Longest Journey, which is something I picked up when I saw it in a bookstore, used bookstore, I think last year, and it's one of the only E.M. Forster books that I have not read. Maurice, which is my personal favorite, something I really loved and which really put E.M. Forster on my radar, and someone I explored further. Passage to India, which is the only E.M. Forster book I did not like. I have read it. And A Room with a View, which is fantastic. If you have not read it, I would recommend that as well. I was very interested in reading Billy Lynn's I was really interested in reading Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. Let's try that again. When it was first released. Waited until it came out in paperback and somehow have never gotten around to reading it. So at some point I should probably just do that. Then we have Tiger Tiger by Margot Fregoso. When I was working at Macmillan, I managed to get a copy of this for free because Picador is a division of Macmillan, and it's supposed to have a very difficult subject matter. It's got a beautiful cover, but because of the difficult subject matter, I've never gotten around to reading it, although I have heard very good things about it. And then this was something that was a staff recommendation at one of my local bookstores, Shakespeare & Company. It's High Noon, The Hollywood Blacklist, and the Making of an American Classic by Glenn Frankel. If you know me, you know I love movies and old Hollywood, the Academy Awards, anything that has anything to do with that. So when this was on the staff recommends shelf, I immediately snapped it up and would love to get to it. I have not yet. I have 2 books by Jonathan Franzen on my shelf, and both of them I have only read half of because I bailed on both. I will always keep my copy of the corrections though, because in that weird way, so the corrections had been released by the time 9/11 happened. However, we had been sold out because it got a really great review and people came in and they had to print more editions. We finally got more copies in that had been sitting in a warehouse somewhere. And I actually purchased my copy on 9/11 because we didn't know when we were going to be allowed back in the store, because our store was in a mall in northern New Jersey, not that far from New York City. And what's really interesting about it is that it has an error the early editions of this book did. They corrected it in later printings. Page 430 and 431 were printed backwards, so you don't read them in order. You read 431 and then 430, and I always thought that is interesting. And then there's always that additional story that I purchased this on 9/11 because I didn't know when I was going to be able to be back in the store. And then there's Freedom, which, whatever. Then we have The Come Down by Rebecca Frumkin, which I never got around to reading. And Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. This is another book that I have had for roughly 20 years and never gotten around to reading. I've heard really good things about it and would love to at some point. Then we have American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which I really did not like at all, and which was disappointment because it had been on my TBR for a very, very long time when I finally got around to it, and I just hated it. So, whoops. Then we have the graphic novel version of Coraline, which I have read, the original version of Coraline, which I have also read, and Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, which I read and really enjoyed and have always thought that I should reread because I remember it being hysterically funny. Then there is An Untamed State by Roxane Gay, which I also discussed in a book I'll revisit recently. Have not gotten around to reading it yet. And then we have 2 books by Elizabeth George, which I have also not gotten around to reading. I'd like to have mystery thrillers around, just so when I'm in the mood for one, I can pick them up. The first one is A Great Deliverance. I believe this is actually the first one in this series about, what's the detective's name? Lindley. And then What Came Before He Shot Her, which is the one that prompted me to purchase Elizabeth George books to try them when this was released, because it got great reviews when it was released. But I figured I would try that one because it is not a Lindley book, but would try the first one in this series as well. And 15, maybe 20 years later, haven't gotten around to either one. Let's find out, because, oh, this one still has the sticker. So this was released in 2007, so 13 years. I've probably had both of them. Then we have a book by Tess Gerritsen, Playing with Fire. I love the Rizzoli & Isles books by Tess Gerritsen. I read most of them on ebook. Again, remember when I used to read ebooks? That's crazy. This one I managed to get an advance copy of from a bookstore in town. And it's not a Rizzoli & Isles novel. My husband loves this book. I thought it was okay. But I do enjoy Tess Gerritsen's books. And now we have 2 books by Amitav Ghosh. I don't know if I'm saying that right. River of Smoke and Sea of Poppies. I have never gotten around to reading any of these books. I believe they are a part of a trilogy. But again, I got these for free when I was working at Macmillan because they are from Picador, and Picador was a division of Macmillan. Then we have And Sons by David Gilbert. This was recommended to me by one of my favorite booksellers I have ever worked with. I used to work with her at the Borders in Livingston, New Jersey. She now works at a Barnes & Noble, but she recommended this to me and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. Then we have Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden, which I have read and actually really enjoyed, even though there are aspects of this that are problematic in modern terms. And same goes with the movie. I enjoyed the movie, but it's a little problematic when you think about the age difference of the people who are the central romance. However, I do remember enjoying it, especially because it is a very interesting kind of history of Japan at a very specific point in time, leading up to, during, and a little bit after World War II. Then we have No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. I got this because I watched the Roosevelts on Netflix. I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but it's a Ken Burns documentary, and I was just so fascinated with the life of Eleanor Roosevelt and her relationship with Franklin that I felt like I wanted to go with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is one of the authoritative sources on them. And then there is The End of Eve by Ariel Gore. This is a book that, when we first moved to Missoula, I was given a gift card, and I can't remember where I first heard of The End of Eve. I want to say it was on like Book Riot or something like that, but it sounded really interesting, and I just have not gotten around to reading it. It's a memoir, and just never got around to reading it. Someday. Okay, in evaluating a TBR for this shelf, there are definitely books in here that I want to read at some point, but the only one I'm going to pull out and prioritize is High Noon by Glenn Frankel, just because I think that's the subject matter really aligns with my interest in it. It's been a while since I've read a book like that, so I need to keep doing it. Moving on to shelf number 3, which I have now cleared off. We start with Sue Grafton. I am a huge fan of the Alphabet series of her books, and actually one of the ones that I own in physical format is missing because I just finished it and it's on the table waiting for me to do a wrap-up of it. So I have A, B, C, D. E is the one that's on the table. F, and then we skip to O, P, Q, and then Y. I know I own a couple of these as ebooks because I thought I would reread them that way, and that by the time I got around to rereading Sue Grafton, I was no longer reading ebooks. I used to own a paperback copy of pretty much every single one, but foolishly gave them away at some point when I was moving, thinking, what are the odds I'll reread these? Well, I will reread these. So I've been recollecting them and have some gaps that I need to fill in. Then we have The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass. This is a book that I was really excited to read at one point in my life, roughly about 15 years ago. After that point, some revelations came out about Gunter Grass and made him a little problematic, kind of backburnered the book for me. And then what really did it is that in 2009, when I first started at Columbia, the first literature class I took at Columbia included The Flounder by Gunter Grass, which is a book I absolutely hated. Absolutely hated. Hated. Let me say hated one more time. So maybe someday I will get around to The Tin Drum, but I really did not like The Flounder, in case you couldn't tell. Then we have a Pulitzer Prize winner that I picked this up before I ever got the idea to do my Pulitzer Prize project. It's The Keepers of the House by Shirley Ann Grau, and it's one of the ones I am most looking forward to as part of that project. And then we have The Heart of the Matter by Graham Greene. This is another one of those Penguin great books of the 20th century. I mentioned that when these were released around the year 2000, I was obsessed with these editions. I used to own a whole bunch of them. I got rid of a couple of them, but I still have The Heart of the Matter and would love to get around to it. Then we have two books by Garth Greenwell. The first one is Cleanness, which I have not gotten around to reading. It was just published this year. And What Belongs to You, which I have also not gotten around to reading. So between both of these, I really need to get around to reading some Garth Greenwell, especially since I've heard good things about both here on BookTube. Continuing the list of things that I can't believe I haven't gotten around to yet, Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. Feels like everybody has read this book but me at this point, and someday I will get around to it. Then we have Ordinary People by Judith Guest. Ordinary People is actually one of my favorite movies. I remember the book being okay, but I love the movie and will always keep it around because of that connection. Then we have The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Guys, do you remember when Today Show had a book club? I think they kind of do now with Jenna Bush. Is that a thing? I don't know. But yeah, I read this and I very much enjoyed it. And now you get to listen to Jamie going crazy. We have Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday. This is something that I have not gotten around to reading and would still like to at some point. And Enon by Paul Harding. This is something I've managed to snag a copy of at Book Expo. It's an advanced reader's copy. And I was holding on to it because I wanted to read Tinkers first. I think this has... So this follows the grandson of the protagonist in Tinkers, and I wanted to read Tinkers first. I never got around to reading Tinkers. I don't even own a copy of Tinkers, so you can see how that went. Now we have the Academy Awards Handbook by John Harkness. This was revised and updated for the year of 2003. You can see the most recent winners of Academy Awards at the time are on the cover. They have not done a version of this since. But for a while, they did release a new one every year, and I bought it every year because this was my Bible at the time they were released. Again, I'm a huge Academy Awards fan. Don't really know where that came from, but I am, and here we are. Then we have an entire series of books by Mark Harris. These were books that I had stored at my father's house in New Jersey, and when he moved, they were part of the boxes that he sent to me. The only one I've read is Bang the Drum Slowly, but because I enjoyed that book, I wanted to try to get to some of the others. So there's The Southpaw, Bang the Drum Slowly, A Ticket for a Seam Stitch, and It Looked Like Forever. And I'm going to hold on to them because it would still be fun to kind of read the whole collection. Mark Harris. And I have two of his books right here. Pictures at a Revolution, 5 Movies in the Birth of the New Hollywood, and 5 Came Back, A Story of Hollywood and the Second World War. I have read Pictures at a Revolution. I have not gotten around to 5 Came Back yet. However, 5 Came Back was turned into a docuseries on Netflix. I think there are 3 episodes narrated by Meryl Streep, who... love her. And so I need to get to read this one, but I love Pictures at a Revolution. I would say it is one of my favorite books. It examines the pivot of Hollywood from the studio system to what we know it of today using 1967 as the discussion point, and it talks about it through the 5 movies that were nominated for Best Picture that year, including Bonnie and Clyde, which is on the cover, and how they signify the direction where Hollywood had been, where it was, and where it was going. It's fascinating. I have wanted to read a book by Kent Harr for a really long time, and I have never gotten around to it. The one that I own is Benediction. Got to do it at some point. And then there's Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which is one of my favorite books, but I did not own a copy, so I went and bought one last year, and here it is on my shelf right now. Now we have 2 books by Mark Helprin. First one is Memoir from an Ant-Proof Case. In part 1 of my bookshelf tour, I mentioned that there were a couple of books that the GM of one of the borders I worked at recommended to me, and I read the first one. I didn't name the first one. It was Nicholson Baker's The Fermata that I read, and it was just really sexual, and that kind of weirded me out, and I never got around to reading any of the other books that he recommended. This was one of them. And then I also have The Winter's Tale, just because for a while there, at least in the place where I was living, people would tell me that this book is amazing, it's one of the best things ever written, and I purchased it and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. And now I don't really hear people talk about it anymore, so I don't wonder if that's something that's kind of location specific. Who knows? And this is not the only Ernest Hemingway book I own, but it's the only one that's on this shelf. It's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Have not gotten around to reading it. The only Ernest Hemingway books I have read are short stories. I've not read any of his novels or longer works, so got to do that someday at some point. I could pull a lot of books out for TBR on this shelf, but I'm going to try to keep it simple. Keepers of the House, Cleanness, What Belongs to You, Fates and Furies. I toyed with the idea of Asymmetry, but I'm going to leave it for now. And Five Came Back by Mark Harris. We're going to call it good right there. We're into shelf number 4, and here we go. The other 2 books I own by Ernest Hemingway. The Old Man and the Sea, which is his Pulitzer Prize winner, and even though it's really slim, I've never gotten around to reading it. Obviously, it's part of my Pulitzer Prize project, so I will be at some point. And then there is A Movable Feast, which I believe is nonfiction about his time in Paris. It was published posthumously, Memoir of Paris in the 1920s. So yeah, it's not fiction, but I think that would be an interesting thing to learn more about. When I was working at the Borders in the Short Hills Mall in New Jersey, one of my coworkers told me that Midnight Cowboy by James Leo Herlihy was one of his all-time favorite novels, and actually he said it was his favorite. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm always curious by the books that people describe as their favorite, so I got it and I read it and I actually really liked it, and it's a good companion to the movie if you have not read the book. Then we have Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, a new translation of it. This is the only book by him that I have read. I remember really liking it, but I also don't remember a lot of details about it, so I should probably reread it at some point. Next we have The Price of Salt, or Carol, by Patricia Highsmith. I purchased this because I remember reading The Talented Mr. Ripley around the time the movie version of that came out. What was that, the year 1999? Somewhere around there. And I always wanted to read more books by Patricia Highsmith and somehow never got around to them. So the release of the movie Carol got me to do it. I saw the movie before I read the book, and it's a really interesting book. I would definitely recommend it. It allows its characters to be messy, which I found very intriguing and kind of refreshing. Then we have Smilla's Sense of No by Peter Hoag. Smilla's Sense of Snow by Peter Hoag. This is another book I got when I was working at Macmillan because it is Picador. Picador is a division of Macmillan. FSG is also part of Macmillan, so most of the books that I did get from that time period came from one of those imprints. Have not gotten around to reading this yet. The same time I bought The End of Eve, I got Be Safe, I Love You, which is a novel. And again, I feel like it was Book Riot that had recommended a bunch of books, because otherwise I have no memory of where I heard about this book for the first time. I believe it deals with PTSD, if I remember correctly. Now we have 2 queer books. We have first Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran, which I got around to reading for the first time last year. And there are a lot of aspects of this book that have not aged well, but it's still really interesting as a slice of life. It has a deeply unlikable protagonist, which is kind of interesting, and yet I liked the book. So there you go. And then there is The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst, which I believe won the 2004 Man Booker Prize for Fiction, which is when I picked this up. And I remember having a kind of love-hate relationship. However, I watched, I think it's a BBC adaptation of it, and really enjoyed that, so go figure. Then we have a book I really can't believe I have not read. It's Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. A lot of people read this in high school. I did not. My high school did English classes in a very different way. They tried to make them like college courses, and because of that, I didn't read a lot of books that most people typically read when they are in high school. This is one that I missed. Then we have The Berlin Stories by Christopher Isherwood. This includes the inspiration for the musical Cabaret, of course the movie Cabaret, and the old play I Am a Camera, which had the character of Sally Bowles, who appears here. I remember enjoying this book, not as much as the movie Cabaret, but yeah. And then I purchased one of these little pocket Picador classics of A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood because I would like to get around to reading more books by him, and that seems like a good place to start. Then we have 3 by Kazuo Ishiguro. First, Never Let Me Go, which I know is kind of a Marmite book. A lot of people don't like it. I happen to love it. I would call it one of my favorites. A Pale View of Hills, which I have not read but sounds really interesting. And The Remains of the Day, which again, I really liked. I've heard people have problems with it, but I like it. Then we have Speak No Evil by Uzodinma Owela, which I finally got around to reading last month and did not enjoy very much. And The Sleepwalker's Guide to Dancing by Mira Jacob. I got a copy of this around the time it was released, and Never got around to reading it. However, I'm much more interested in reading it now because I did read her graphic novel memoir, Good Talk, and really loved that. So now I'm curious to go back and read her novel. When I was in college, I always liked to take classes that would challenge me to read books. I was a little intimidated to read on my own. One of the last classes I took before I dropped out of college was a Henry James class, and I have this, which has The Turn of the Screw and other short fiction. It was one of the texts that we used, and I had a very mixed relationship to Henry James. I didn't love anything, but there were aspects of a lot of the things that we read in that class that I did like, but I had a very love-hate relationship with him. Then we have A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, which won the Booker Prize. Actually, I had been visiting my family in Vermont in October, shortly before the Booker Prize was announced, and I think we were heading home on the day that the Booker Prize was announced. I picked this up at my favorite bookstore, which is Northshire Books in Manchester, Vermont, and the day we were flying home, I remember being on the plane and checking the news, and it had been announced that it won, so I felt really smarmy, and I started to read it, but I also had a cold, and I had taken cold medicine, and by the time we landed, I found I could not remember anything that had happened in the book. So I put it down until I was off, thinking when I get done with the cold, I'll pick it back up, and I never got around to picking it back up, because that always happens to me. So, still need to read this. Then we have a bunch of books by Ha Jin, who is an author. I really like some of his earlier stuff, have a bit of a problem with some of the later stuff. Let's go The Bridegroom. I know I read this, short stories from what I remember, but I also have no memory of any of the stories in it. But I'm pretty sure I liked them, for whatever that's worth. A Map of Betrayal, this is an advanced copy of it, and I did not like this one. I tried to like it very hard while I was reading it, and the more I thought about it afterwards, it's like, just admit it, you didn't like it, Greg, it's fine. Ocean of Words, this is also stories, I believe, or is this fiction? I think it's stories. But I absolutely loved this book. Yes, short stories. Absolutely loved it, it was really good. Waiting, which won the National Book Award, I believe. Yes, won the National Book Award, and I really liked it. I got very frustrated with the character, but I think it's because his experience of the world is so different from mine that you constantly want to be like, why are you like this? But I really enjoyed the book. My favorite book by Ha Jin is War Trash. If you have not read this book, please check it out, read it. I should probably reread it at some point, but I really loved this book. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize the year that it was released. It won the Faulkner Award. I can't remember what won the Pulitzer instead of it. I love it. I would say it's up there on my favorites. Now we have two books by Adam Johnson. The first one is Fortune Smiles, which is a collection of short stories. I got this the same trip that I got Brief History of Seven Killings, and like that book, I have not gotten around to reading this. They had a signed copy at Northshire, so I bought that one, and would like to get around to reading it at some point. The one of his that I really need to read, though, is The Orphan Master Sun, which is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and one that I've been excited about since it was released, but have not read. And now we have several books by Dennis Johnson. First is Jesus' Son, which I really liked, and I should go back and reread it to see if I would still like it, because I read it a long time ago, but I remember really liking it a lot. Dennis Johnson is an interesting author because a lot of his books are very different. Largest of the Sea Maiden was his final story collection. I have not gotten around to reading it yet. I have not gotten around to Resuscitation of a Hanged Man either, and really need to do that. And then there's Train Dreams, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2012, I believe, which was the year that there were 3 finalists, but no winner. And honestly, I feel like this one would have been the odds-on favorite to win. However, I remember reading it, and I've forgotten most of the details, and I remember thinking it was just okay. I used to own a copy of Tree of Smoke, and somehow must have gotten rid of it along the way. That was a book I tried to read when I had the flu, and it's just a little bit trippy, so if you're reading it when you have the flu, oh wow. It was a lot, so I had to put it down. It was like getting bombed with napalm, which is probably actually a good experience for that book. But anyway, I don't know what happened to my copy of it, but because I always thought I should get around to rereading that, or actually reading that for the first time. And yeah, apparently I don't own it. And the final book on shelf number 4 is When We Rise by Cleve Jones, which I did read and did enjoy. It is his memoir as being part of the gay rights movement, and I thought it was fascinating. Again, some tough calls on TBR items for this shelf, but the ones I went with are Their Eyes Were Watching God, A Single Man, A Pale View of Hills, The Orphan Master Sun, and that's it. Okay, now we're into shelf number 5, the final shelf in the middle bookcase, bookshelf number 2, and let's get into it. The first one is The Known World by Edwin P. Jones. This is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And again, I've had this for about 20 years. Let me see what year it was released. Whenever it came out in paperback is when I bought this. And I have not gotten around to it since 2003. So 17 years. And I've heard really great things, especially on BookTube lately. So I really need to get around to this. Then we have How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. I've talked about this a lot recently because I just read it for the first time last month. No One Belongs Here More Than You, stories by Miranda July. I've read a couple, not all. And I don't remember I only remember one of the stories that I've read. At some point I should probably finish the rest. Then we have 2 books by Han Kang. The first is Human Acts, which I have not gotten around to reading, but I'm thinking of picking it up for Women in Translation Month. And then The Vegetarian, also by Han Kang, which I read for Women in Translation Month last year. And I'd been really looking forward to it, and I thought it was just okay. And I think part of that was really boosted anticipations and expectations for it. Then we have Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata, who is a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Have not gotten around to reading it, but would really like to. The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. Have not gotten around to this one either. Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane, which came out last year, and actually I am reading this right now. However, I'm listening to the audio, not reading the print book, which is interesting. Another Pulitzer Prize winner, it's Ironweed by William Kennedy. They had this at my library last year, so I had to pick it up since it's part of my project. It is a movie tie-in, but what are you going to do? Beggars can't be choosers. On the Road by Jack Kerouac. Have not gotten around to reading this, even though I went to high school in San Francisco, and it's kind of seen as a quintessentially San Francisco book in some ways or in certain circles. And again, it is one of those Penguin Great Books of the 20th Century versions that I was really obsessed with. And then One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. I used to have a signed version of this because in the 90s, Ken Kesey had a stroke and his life was saved by a drug that the company my father worked for at the time had produced. So he did some PR for them, and somebody got me a signed copy of the book, and it disappeared when we moved from California to New Jersey, which makes me mad to this day. Then we have 2 books by Lily King. The first one is Euphoria, which I have read. Really liked when I was reading it, and since then it has kind of faded from my memory to the point where it just seems okay, and it's interesting when that happens. But then there's Writers and Lovers, which I have not gotten around to reading yet, and I've heard very mixed things so far. I've read a lot of books by Stephen King, but I only own 2. The first one is Different Seasons, which contains Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, which inspired the movie Shawshank Redemption, The Body, which inspired the movie Stand By Me, Apt Pupil, which inspired the movie, and one other that has not inspired any movie at all, and I'm blanking on the name of it. What is it? The Breathing Method, whatever that is. And Dr. Sleep, which I purchased when it came out because I remembered loving The Shining, and I recently reread The Shining and thought it was kind of just okay. So I hadn't gotten around to reading this yet, and maybe someday. Then we have 2 books by Barbara Kingsolver, Pigs in Heaven, which I picked up from my library because I'm a fan of a lot of the books that I've read of hers. I have not read a bunch of them, including Pigs in Heaven yet, but I love The Poisonwood Bible, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, did not win. Love this book so much. If you haven't read it, do it. Then we have Out by Natsuo Kirino. Have not gotten around to reading this yet. I just bought it earlier this year because I was really obsessed with these vintage Japan editions of books. I have a couple of them, and this is the first one. Redeployment by Phil Clay, which I read when it was released and don't remember all that much about now. It's kind of interesting again when that happens. Then we have Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs by Chuck Klosterman, which I really liked. It's also the only thing by Chuck Klosterman that I have read that I did like. And it's interesting when that happens as well. Then there's Genderqueer, a graphic memoir by Maya Kobabe. Read this last year, love it. Definitely recommend this. Then we have the script of Urinetown the Musical, which I did read and I saw on Broadway and enjoyed both times. Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer, which I have read as well. And I think when I read this, I had a problem because it is presented as a sort of murder mystery, like a true crime book that includes the history of the Mormon Church, but it's really a history of the Mormon Church disguised as a true crime book, because the crime at the center is barely in it, it feels like, because almost the entire middle of the book, maybe 80%, is taken up with the history of the Mormon Church, which is interesting, but not what I thought I was getting into when I read it. Then we have 2 books by Larry Kramer. The The first one, I'm not going to show you the cover of or say the name, but the name of it is a gay slur. And the reason I'm so skittish about the name of it is that one of my videos was randomly flagged for having inappropriate language, and all I talked about in that video, it was my wrap-up of the last round of the BookTube prize, and I talked about 9/11 and sexual abuse, I think. And so interesting. So I just don't want to rock the boat. So I'm going to avoid the language. It is a book that I desperately want to read. Larry Kramer died a little over a month ago, and I want to honor his memory. He also wrote The Normal Heart and The Destiny of Me, which are collected here. Normal Heart, fantastic. I saw it performed. It emotionally devastated me all over again reading it in play form. Destiny of Me, not so much. Coming to the end, we have Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn. Have not gotten around to reading this yet. Belonging by Nora Krug, graphic memoir. I did read this last year and thought it was interesting. And The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. I have read a book by Milan Kundera with The Story of Laughter and Forgetting, I think is the name of it, but I have not gotten around to this one, and I really need to at some point. That wraps up the bookshelf tour portion of it. TBR items from that last shelf are The Known World, Snow Country, Out, and the Larry Kramer book that shall not be named. Give me a moment, and I will go back and count the books that I have read versus the books I have not read, because I think that's an interesting thing to do for me. Okay, I've done the math, and out of bookshelf 2 there were 135 titles. I've read 69, which accounts for 51.11% of the books. So I improved off of this one. I've actually read the majority of books in this shelf. That's a pleasant surprise for me. Maybe it has a lot to do with the Sue Grafton collection and the fact that I've read most of those. As a total so far, in the first two shelves, there are 278 books total, and I have read 129 of them, which comes out to a percentage of 46.4. So overall, I'm trending down, but I'm actually close. I've read roughly half of the books so far, and it'll be interesting to see if that number continues as I get into the other two. Again, there's one shelf here and one that my phone is propped up on right now. So we'll see how that goes. But I just thought it was interesting to include that as a fact. I like to keep my shelves aspirational with things that I would like to read, but it's good to keep an eye on how much you've read, how much you haven't. It's been something I've been kind of curious about for a while, so I'm using the bookshelf tours as an excuse to check in on the numbers there. Anyway, if you've watched this far, thank you for that. You are an all-star, and I will be back with another installment. Again, I don't know when, because this takes a little bit of time, and time is very precious, as you all know. So we'll see. But hopefully soon. And until next time, happy reading.